walked into my waiting room, there were 4 people in there. One man jumped to his feet and stretched out his hand to me. He said, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "Of course I remember you." And he said, "But it's 27 years since I last saw you." That's right. I remember you. "How can you remember me," he said, "when you see so many people?" So already you see he was demoting himself as someone that perhaps cannot expect to be remembered. And probably we all do the same. We want to be remembered, and then we say, "But I can't expect to be remembered, and then I don't deserve to be remembered." So we need to see right at the beginning, we've got this a social remembering. Do you remember John? Of course I remember John. Do you remember Beth? Of course we do. Over the years, there's the social remembering. Then there's the more personal remembering of other things in our life. The culture, the part of our culture of remembering. And there is the identity of our remembering. But then there's what I call the trajectory of our remembering. We project something, we'd like to be something, we'd like us to be remembered in the future. So the posterity of memory. So there it is. We have all these things about us of remembering. Social remembering, the cultural remembering, the personal identity remembering, the trajectory remembering, and the posterity of what will happen after we're no longer here. Another person came to church a couple of weeks ago and then rang me and said, "So my daughter came to church too. Did you see her?" And I said, "I don't know your daughter." You'd recognise her. She was wearing a green hat. Well, there are only 2 people who wear hats in this congregation as a general rule. So I thought, well, the green hat must have been her daughter. So I said, "Oh, so that was your daughter." Now notice I didn't remember the daughter, but I remember the green hat. And that's sometimes what we do. When I spoke of the person I met 27 years ago, I remember the details, his life. But when it comes to the other person, I only remember the green hat. And often that's what it comes down to, that sometimes we only remember specific things. We remember a person did something quite stupid. We can't remember the person at all, but we can remember that stupid thing that happened. Or another person may have a lifetime of achievements, great achievements behind them. But one action can happen, and that's the thing we remember. We don't remember the lifetime of achievements, or we dismiss them all simply to hold on to that one thing. So Jesus of Nazareth said, when you take a piece of bread and wine, remember me, would you? Remember me. And is it that important that we should remember him? What are we remembering? The bread and wine or what? In the Old Testament Bible, the question is asked, will God remember me? Are we special to God? And in the New Testament letter of Peter, the assurance is given, but once you didn't belong anywhere, but now, remember you are the special people, you belong to God. So when we come to the sacrament of communion, it sits on several rememberings. Do you remember how you've come to be who you are? Do you remember anything about the story of how you were once released from the past and you become part of a new possibility in the future? Do you remember the people who waved you on and told you to take a new path? Be part of a new path. Do you remember when Jesus said to his disciples, remember me? What was he saying? Will you remember that I was pointing to a new pathway? You may not remember very much about me. In fact, as we read the story of Jesus, there's so many things we really can't rely upon. Did he really say those words? What was he really like? What did he in fact do? Can we rely on that? One thing we can rely upon, so the scriptures say and so tradition has said, is his pointing finger. He was pointing to something. And we need to look to see what he was pointing to. What was it? Perhaps through all the words of the scriptures, backwards and forwards, the pointing finger was pointing to goodness, to kindness, to wholeness, to self-worth. You are worth something. And then through it all, he was pointing to a new way, a new and different life. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember me. Remembering surely is the most astonishing gift. Memory, once you've lost it, you know, all of us here today relies so heavily on memory. Once you've lost it, you don't know who you are. You don't know anything reliable about your past. And you can't remember what's important for your future. What an extraordinary gift we've been given in memory. Gives us identity, our personhood, our place, our belonging, our context of who we are and can be. Memory gives us a meaning to our existence, gives meaning to the lives of others. What would we do without our memory? Memory says this is the very context in which we live. This is what's of ultimate significance. Without that, do you want to be remembered? It's interesting that some people say, look, I don't want to be remembered. We downgrade ourselves and say, I've got nothing to be remembered about or for. But if you come and look at it again and say, oh, surely we want to be remembered as people who once walked this way. And what did we ourselves point to? We were pointing beyond ourselves to something good, were we? Or something ugly? What do you want to be remembered for? Who, me? Yes, he said, do this in remembrance of me. The meanness of it. Me means myself, my identity, my meaning, my purpose. Me is who I am. This is what I think is worth living for. Me. This is the very cradle of human kindness. Or it can also be the very nest of human nastiness. But allow ourselves to keep pointing to the possibility of being part of the cradle of kindness. Do you want to be remembered for that? I hope so. This is the best I have to offer. This is the worst I could do in the world. Which one will I take? How do you want to be remembered? As someone who caught a glimpse of good possibilities and responded to them? As someone who walked away from those possibilities and had nothing to say to them? Well, you might say, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Sooner or later, we'll all be forgotten. Just a name on a piece of paper. And even the piece of paper will be lost. Nothing to nothingness. Unless, in the very short time in which we lived, you saw you were part of the eternal adventure of being human. Your memory, your mind, and then you became aware of your emotions, the emotions that became loaded on your memory. Yes, remembering can be part of a great emotion. Emotions of regret, of fear, of guilt, of grief, of sadness. We know those. But they can also be emotions that can lift us from where we are. Let us Hear how our memories can be invested with the emotions of gratitude, of enjoyment, of anticipation, of excitement, of exhilaration, of ebullience. Memories that make a difference because they celebrate good feelings. Memories that are grand expressions of enhancing emotions. Memories that can easily close the door on everything good, but open the doors to lift us into a better life. Emotions are important in our memories. Do this in remembrance of me, he said, and around him were the emotions. It is easy to be so deeply absorbed in the banalities of life, in the irrelevant things of life, in the things that upset us in life, the miserable manners of life. But do this in remembrance of me, he said, as one pointing to better things in life, to better human beings, to better relationships, to better memories. So often, you see, we get our minds jammed into negative memories, nasty memories, into going nowhere memories, the negatives of our non-existence. But then I ask you to call on the great paradigm of the F's that I've put before you many times, the filtering F. Filter out the negative memories. Filter out the negative emotions. Filter out the negative preoccupations and filter in the memories that lift you, the memories that point to what you can be yet, the memories that are loaded with good things of the past. Let us see whether we can do that. Sometimes your filtering systems don't work effectively. We can't filter. You need then to press what I call the release button. The release button releases you, it frees you from all the past. And it frees you to remember the good. And that's what Jesus was talking about when he said, remember me. Because he was holding in front of them their past. You've been freed from what is past. And you're being freed to be part of something in the future. The release button releases you from the tyranny of the imprisoned self. And it points you to a remarkable transformation of the inspirational self. All part of how you'll be remembered. All part of it. All part of how you would, in your best moments, want to live. And want other people to see that this is the way you live. Freed from the tyranny of your own negativities. And free to experience the transformation of your best emotions and best behavior. Now, the release that I speak about, the release button, doesn't release us from our mortality. The mortality of life remains. The mortality of our illnesses and our injuries and our hurts, our anxieties, our aging. But the release lifts us to be part of something different, even so. Some of us may settle for that likelihood of being amongst the unremembered and console ourselves in various ways that ultimately we're all part of those stark words which tells us to remember that we're part of the dust, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. But others may wonder, why did the stars line up for Charles Darwin? Why did the stars line up for people like Carl Jung or Gustav Mahler, the millions that are remembered? Why them, not us? Why were we not Robbie Burns or Margaret Mead or Gwen Harwood, the poet, or Doris Lessing, the author? And then we have a second thought. And we recognize that we can't be any of them. And maybe then we remember. remember the story. Zaja, the old Hasidic Hebraic saying. At the end of the age, he said, they will not ask Zaya, why was Zaya not Moses? They will ask Zaya, why was Zaja not Zaja? Jesus of Nazareth was well aware of the context in which he lived. And as he passed the bread and wine to his disciples, he said, do this and remember me. How will you remember me? Remember what I stood for. Remember what I was pointing to. And if you can't put together a coherent story of what I said or who I was, remember that. Remember what I was pointing to. He was pointing to a better way, to a better human being, to a better human community. And we might follow his example. Remembering. Remembering, how will you be remembered? Of course, it depends on your sense of worth. Am I worth remembering? It depends on the sense of time. How long will I be remembered? It depends on the context in which we live now and the context of my life that is already gone. Every day, I listen to people remembering who they once were, remembering what was important to them in their past, remembering what lifted them and enlarged their personality, remembering what pointed them to the good, the true, and the beautiful. We can do that too. Pause to remember. And noting too that remembering your identity, your tradition, your context, the meaning you put on life, the emotions that you brought to life, the purposes that you pursued, the people that helped you to be bigger people, helped you to appreciate the gift of life, and the power of your mind as it exerted that filtering process that filtered out the ugly and filtered in the good, that filtered out the negative and filtered in the positive. The astonishing realization, remember that astonishing realization that the pointing finger is there. The pointing finger is there, pointing to the best in being human and the best in being part and building part of a good, caring human community. Remember me, he said. And remembering me, we remember ourselves and what we were pointing to. Would you please stand? I invite you all to gather round the holy table to hear again those very words. Do this in remembrance of me. Would you sing the communion hymn? The words are on your service paper.